Hey there. Tonight I want to take you back to a time so early that even the word early feels too modern for it. To a place before kings, before carved stone, before the sun had practiced the first edge of dawn, when there was only dark water and a waiting silence. And hidden inside that silence was the first shape of a bird that would one day become one of the oldest promises human beings ever whispered to themselves. The promise that what falls into darkness may rise again. If that sounds like the kind of story you want beside you tonight, go ahead and leave a like. Subscribe if you feel like returning for more journeys like this. And then let the room soften around you. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw loosen. Let the little thoughts of the day drift to the back of the room like dust in candlelight. Imagine the flame near us burning quietly, not with drama, but with patience. Imagine the air carrying that faint scent of warm wax and old wood. Somewhere, far outside this room, modern life is still moving too fast, still blinking and buzzing and asking for things. But we are stepping away from all of that. We are going somewhere older than urgency. Somewhere so old that no footsteps have yet pressed the earth, because there is no earth yet to press. In the beginning of this old Egyptian imagination, before the desert stretched beneath the stars, before the Nile drew its green line through the land, before pyramids leaned upward out of the sand like stone thoughts, there was none. The primordial water. Not a sea you could sail. Not a river you could drink from. Not a storm. Not a lake. Something larger and more unsettling than all of those things. Endless black water without shore, without current, without horizon, without direction. Water that was not yet part of a world, but the deep and unformed substance from which a world might someday emerge. I have always found it strange and quietly beautiful that so many ancient stories begin not with noise, but with suspension. Not with action, but with waiting. The old Egyptian priests, writing on papyrus and carving on temple walls many centuries later, preserved the memory of this first condition as a place where everything existed in possibility and nothing yet had shape. If you were standing there with me, which of course no human could, you would not see darkness the way we usually mean darkness. You would see a darkness so complete that sight itself would feel unfinished, as though the eye had not yet learned its task. And then, from this water without edge, something rises. Not a mountain first. Not a man. Not a temple. A bird. The Egyptians called it Bennu. Later ages, especially Greek and Roman ones, would reshape it, rename it, and carry it into new myths until most of the world would know it under a different name, the phoenix. But before all of that, before translators and travelers and misunderstandings and poetic exaggerations, there is Bennu. And Bennu is not just a beautiful creature appearing inside creation. It belongs to the beginning of creation itself. The source script treats this moment with unusual seriousness, and I think rightly so. Bennu is described not as a bird in the ordinary sense, but as a manifestation of pure creative force. That phrase can sound abstract if you say it too quickly, so let us slow it down. The point is not simply that a magical bird appears. The point is that the first living sign of order takes a form, and that form is radiant, poised, and awake. Bennu stands at the seam between divine energy and visible life. It is shape emerging from shapelessness. Consciousness stirring inside the void. Picture it lifting from the dark. At first, only a pale glow above the water. Then the line of a neck. Then the suggestion of wings folded close. The old descriptions compare it to a heron in proportion. Tall, elegant, long-legged, long-necked, grave in the way water birds often are, as if they know things they will never bother explaining. But Bennu is more than any earthly heron. Its plumage seems to hold the colors of the world just before dawn fully becomes itself. Deep blues, purples, shades that look like the last thoughts of night. And on its head burns a crest of gold, not simply bright, but alive, like feather and fire discovered they could inhabit the same body without quarrel. If you were standing there with me, I think the most unnerving detail would be the calmness of it. The world has not yet found its structure, and still this bird rises as if it is not surprised by any of it, as if it has come not to witness a beginning, but to help carry one into being. Then the Bennu cries. That first cry is the hinge of everything. According to the Egyptian theological imagination preserved in the source, the sound is not merely the voice of a sacred bird greeting the void. It is the first sound in existence, the first vibration, the first pulse moving outward through none, the first rupture in eternal silence. And from that sound, or with that sound, creation begins to stir. Light moves toward appearance. Order begins to separate itself from chaos. The stillness of the deep is no longer empty. It has been addressed. You know that feeling when someone speaks in a room that has been silent for a long time, and the space itself changes. The furniture is the same. The walls are the same. The air is the same. Yet everything feels newly arranged because a voice has passed through it. This is that, except larger than a room, larger than a city, larger than anything with walls. The cosmos changes because it has been sounded into movement. There is something profoundly gentle in this idea. Creation does not open with a battle scene here. It does not begin with the slaying of some older monster. It does not begin with a mechanical construction. It begins with presence and voice, with a rising being and a cry, with living order calling the world toward itself. I think that may be one reason the image endured so long. A bird emerging from black water with light on its head and sound in its throat feels less like a theological proposition and more like something the human heart recognizes before it can explain why. The old Egyptian priests would later connect this first emergence to very precise theological language, and they loved precise language when it came to sacred relationships. Bennu was not just associated with creation. It was woven into the foundations of it. In some traditions, the bird's first cry causes the process of creation to begin. In others, it reveals what was hidden within the primordial state. In still others, it is joined to the first mound, or the first appearance of order from the waters. The details vary because ancient theology was not a single tidy spreadsheet. It was layered, local, living, and willing to let sacred meanings overlap. But the constant remains this: Bennu belongs to the first awakening. And that means the future phoenix, the later bird of rebirth and ash and impossible return, begins not as a dramatic funeral spectacle, but as a being of first light, That matters, because it means renewal is written into the myth from the start, not added later as decoration. The bird is born in a world that itself is being born. Rise is there before fire. Return is there before death. The promise hides in the origin. There is also something quietly eerie about the setting. None is not lovely in the easy sense. It is not a moonlit sea painted on a wall for tourists. It is potential without form, and potential without form can feel frightening. There are no borders, and human minds love borders. No landmarks, no distinction between above and below. Just depth, silence, and the possibility of everything. The Bennu does not erase that eeriness. It gives it direction, a center, a first sign that chaos will not remain unchallenged. That may be the earliest form of comfort in the story. Not the comfort that says nothing dark exists. The comfort that says darkness is not final. Honestly, I think that is why people kept carrying this bird forward across centuries, even after they changed its color, altered its homeland, inflated its wings, and loaded it with enough spices to perfume half the ancient world. At its core, the image never stops answering a very old fear. The fear that everything begins in confusion and ends there too. Bennu says otherwise. Something can rise from the flood. Something bright can stand where there was no place to stand. Something living can speak where there was only water and hush. If you were standing in that first hour, and I mean that impossible first hour, when there is not yet morning but there is already the beginning of it, you might see the golden crest catch a light that has not fully become sunlight. You might see the dark water around the bird tremble with the first consequence of sound. You might feel that time itself has not yet started counting. And still, this being somehow already belongs to a rhythm larger than time. Because Bennu is not just first. It is also recurring by nature, though the story has not shown us that fully yet. The bird that rises at the beginning will not belong to a single vanished moment. It will return at dawn, return in cycle, return in memory, return in translated legend. This is only the first appearance, the first patterning of a bird that will eventually become the old Mediterranean emblem of rebirth. But the first pattern matters most, perhaps because it sets the tone. The earliest phoenix is a dawn being before it is an ash being. There is another detail I love in this oldest layer of the myth. The Bennu is both creature and principle. The Egyptians were wonderfully comfortable with that kind of doubleness. Modern thought tends to ask impatient questions like, is it a literal bird or a symbol? The older mind was often wiser, or at least more spacious. It could answer, yes, a sacred bird, a living sign, a theological force, a thing that could be painted, prayed to, imagined, and understood as part of the fabric of creation all at once. The categories did not need to be sharpened until they cut the mystery in half. So let us not rush to flatten it either. For now, stay with the image. The room is quiet. The candle is steady. The modern world is very far away. None stretches out in all directions. Black, deep, still. Then the rising shape. The long neck, the blue and purple plumage, the crest of gold, and the cry, That first cry that breaks the silence and seems to say that form is coming. Light is coming. Rhythm is coming. And that the long future of the world, with all its temples and rulers and collapses and renewals, has just taken its first trembling step. Soon this bird will belong to the sun. Soon it will stand in sacred trees and call the dawn into order again and again. Soon priests will measure time through its pattern, and later travelers will misunderstand it with great enthusiasm, which human beings do almost as naturally as breathing. But before all of that, there is this first emergence, solemn and radiant, a sacred bird lifting from the oldest water, a presence before history, a bright answer to a formless dark. And perhaps that is why the earliest image of the Phoenix story feels less like a spectacle and more like a reassurance whispered into the structure of things. Before there is human grief, before there are tombs, before anyone learns the word loss, the myth has already placed a bright living creature at the threshold between darkness and form. It is as though the world is told from its first moment, gently but firmly, do not be too afraid of the deep. Something can rise from it. Something has. And perhaps that is enough to hold in your mind for one more quiet minute. The first world is opening. The first light is gathering. The Bennu has risen. And the next movement in the story is already waiting just beyond the horizon, where the bird will no longer only belong to the beginning, but to every morning after. Now that the first cry has passed through the dark, and the world has begun to separate itself into something ordered and living, the story takes on a different rhythm. The Bennu does not vanish after its first radiant appearance, as if creation were a task checked off a divine list and then forgotten. No, that would be too simple, and the Egyptian imagination was rarely interested in simple sacred things. Instead, the bird remains woven into the daily maintenance of existence, which is, honestly, a very Egyptian idea. The world is not merely made. It must be renewed. So stay with me by the fire a little longer. Let the room become even softer. Let the candlelight pool along the edges of the furniture. Imagine, beyond this quiet room, a desert morning before heat has fully claimed the day. Stone still cool from the night. Sand holding a faint memory of darkness. The scent of river water somewhere in the distance. Palm leaves barely stirring. The sky pale, then warmer, then touched at the edge by the first gold. And there, in the sacred city of Heliopolis, the bird of beginnings arrives again. In Egyptian theology, Bennu becomes deeply tied to Ra, the great solar deity, whose daily journey across the heavens makes life possible. But this connection is not casual. The old texts do not speak as if Bennu is merely fond of the sun, or likes to perch somewhere with a nice view at sunrise. They speak in far more intimate terms. The bird is described as the soul of Ra, or as a vital expression of his life force. That phrase is easy to glide past, so let us not. It means the Bennu is part of the way divine energy enters the visible world. It is a living sign of solar power, not in the crude sense of heat alone, but in the sacred sense of animation, order, awakening, continuity. Each dawn, as Ra prepares to begin his celestial passage, the Bennu appears in Heliopolis. This city, one of the great centers of solar worship in Egypt, is not merely a geographic location in the story. It is a meeting point between heaven and earth, ritual and cosmos, astronomy and devotion. If you were standing there with me, somewhere near the temple precincts before sunrise, you would hear almost nothing at first. Perhaps soft sandals over stone, perhaps the murmur of a priest, perhaps a faint movement in the leaves, but mostly stillness. The kind of stillness that waits for significance. Then the bird comes, not in haste, not with frantic wing beats. Bennu belongs to the dawn too deeply to arrive like anything ordinary. It settles upon the sacred trees, especially the Persea and the sycamore, and suddenly the whole scene becomes a kind of living theology. The Persea tree, always green, always associated with life and endurance, offers one sort of symbolism. The sycamore, broad and sheltering, associated with heaven, nourishment, and the bridge between worlds, offers another. Bennu in these branches is not simply beautiful, it is meaningful in layers. Solar fire meeting living wood, heaven leaning into earth, renewal taking a visible seat. The descriptions of the bird remain some of the most striking in the tradition. Heron-like in stance, with a long neck and impossibly elegant legs. Yes, but clothed in colors that seem to belong to the threshold between darkness and day. Deep blue, purple. The shades of the sky before sunrise commits itself. And above all of that, the crest, golden, luminous, not quite ordinary feather, not quite literal flame, but some living union of the two. If later ages turned the phoenix into a creature of obvious fire, the Egyptian imagination is subtler here. The fire is sacred, but it is controlled, dignified, held in balance. The Bennu is majestic without needing to be theatrical. And then it cries again. This second kind of cry, the recurring cry of dawn, is different from the first cry that opened creation, but it echoes it. That is what matters. Each morning the sound announces more than a sunrise. It renews the pattern established at the beginning. It wakes not just Ra, but all the creative forces of the world. Plants, animals, welfare, water, movement, time, order, all of them are stirred again. The world does not simply continue by inertia. It is awakened. I think that may be one of the most moving parts of the myth. Mourning is not treated as an automatic mechanical event. It is a restoration, a daily answer to the possibility that chaos might creep back in during the night. The Egyptians knew darkness was not just the absence of light. It was also the place where disorder gathered strength. So dawn mattered, and the Bennu, standing in the sacred trees of Heliopolis, belonged to dawn's victory. You know that feeling when you wake before everyone else, and for a moment the whole house feels paused, and then the first small sound changes it all. A kettle, a step in the hall, a curtain shifting. Suddenly the day begins. Bennu is that first sound for the world, except magnified into ritual and eternity. It is the signal that things are still held together. This is where the concept of Ma quietly enters the scene, even if the source script does not stop to lecture on it. Ma at his order, balance, rightness, the fit of things under divine harmony. It is the opposite of the old formlessness, the opposite of destructive chaos. Bennu belongs to Ma not passively, actively. The cry, the perch, the timing, the radiance at dawn. All of it participates in the ongoing task of keeping the world from sliding backward into disorder. And so the bird is not simply admired. It is necessary. Sometimes the Bennu is imagined accompanying the solar bark itself, flying beside Ra during his journey across the heavens. I love that image because it enlarges the bird without making it monstrous. The sky becomes a river overhead. The bark of the sun moves along its fixed and shining course. And beside it, or near it, the Bennu, companion and guardian, witness and participant. The sun's journey is never presented as trivial. It is a passage that must be completed each day against the pressure of forces that would undo the world. Bennu belongs to that passage. If you were standing there with me in the first full moment of dawn, you might see the bird's golden crest answer the arriving sunlight. For a second, the distinction between the two would blur. Which is reflecting which? Is the sun crowning the bird, or is the bird heralding the sun? The Egyptians would likely smile at that question and refuse to choose. Sacred relationships rarely behave themselves under modern analysis. The sacred trees matter too, and deserve more than a passing mention. The persea tree with its green leaves and sweet fruit had associations with life, memory, and ongoing vitality. The sycamore carried different but complementary meanings: heaven, shelter, nourishment, the link between upper and lower realms. Bennu choosing these places was not random. It made the scene readable to anyone versed in temple symbolism. Fire and leaf, gold and green, bird and branch, solar force and earthly fertility. It is all one visual sentence. I have always found it oddly comforting that this great guardian of cosmic renewal is still, in form, a bird. Not a wall, not a weapon, not some crushing engine of divine authority. A bird, graceful, balanced, light enough for branches. It suggests that sacred endurance may look quieter than we expect. Not loud power, poised presence. The bird's role at dawn also explains why later traditions would attach it so strongly to renewal. Even before self-immolation enters the fully developed myth, Bennu is already a renewal being. The daily recurrence comes first. Every dawn is a smaller version of the first creation. Every appearance in the sacred trees says again what the first emergence said in none. Light can return. Order can hold. Life can begin again. Fire and ash will become important later. Yes, but dawn is the earlier theology. Morning before funeral pyre. Awakening before spectacular resurrection. This daily ritual also places Bennu inside time in a very particular way. It belongs both to the first beginning and to each recurring morning. That is already more than ordinary time can hold. The bird is not trapped inside a single mythical event that happened once and passed away. It stands at a crossing point between origin and recurrence, between primordial moment and repeated world. That is why, when later Egyptian priests linked the Bennu to larger astronomical cycles. The connection felt natural rather than forced. A being that helps renew each day can also help measure ages. At Heliopolis, priests watched the sky with great care. This mattered because Egyptian religion was never only emotional or poetic. It was also observational, patterned, tied to stars, floods, calendars, and the steady intelligence of cycles. They noticed rising lights. They watched the horizon. They tracked regularities. So a sacred bird tied to dawn could become something more than a local temple symbol. It could become a marker of cosmic rhythm itself. But before we move into the vast arithmetic of ages, I want to remain a little longer in this dawn scene, because it is too beautiful to rush. Imagine temple courtyards still half in shadow, the stone columns holding coolness from the night, incense not yet fully lit, a priest lifting his eyes toward the branches, another listening, the city around them not yet loud, not yet crowded, not yet fully awake. Then the Bennu, descending with that grave waterbird elegance, though no earthly marsh has ever held anything quite like it. Its feathers carrying the colors of the retreating dark, its crest carrying the certainty of the coming sun. It settles. The leaves move slightly, and then the cry, clean and deliberate, runs outward over stone, over river, over field, over sleeping houses, over everything waiting to be called back into order. That cry is not sentimental. It is beautiful, yes, but beauty here has work to do. It stirs the world. It wakes the divine procession. It pushes back the old danger that the Egyptian imagination never forgot. The danger that form can unravel, that order can weaken, that chaos is patient. The Bennu's daily appearance is therefore not decorative religion. It is maintenance, sacred upkeep. The world begins again because the right things are done. The right sounds are made. The right powers are present. Honestly, there is something almost charming in how practical that feels. The cosmos needs tending. The gods have their tasks. The bird has its place. The priests keep their observations. The sun must rise properly. One can almost imagine an ancient temple functionary muttering that if everyone would simply do what they were cosmically assigned to do, matters would run much more smoothly. It is a very old kind of sacred administration, and yet beneath that structured calm lies something much deeper. Bennu at dawn tells the human mind that recurrence is holy, that repetition is not emptiness, that what returns may carry fresh life each time. This may be why the image survived translation into other cultures, even after those cultures misunderstood its subtler meanings. The core pattern is unforgettable. A radiant bird, tied to morning, helping the world awaken. Even stripped of theology, it would linger. With theology, it becomes almost impossible to forget. Soon the story will widen from daily renewal into the longer mathematics of eternity. The Bennu will become not only herald of dawn, but keeper of vast cycles, a being whose life will be measured against stars and calendars rather than seasons. Fire will return in a new way then, and ash too. The bird will one day burn, and that burning will not mean failure, but completion and return. But that later grandeur depends on what has already been established here in Heliopolis. The Bennu renews before it resurrects. It repeats before it transforms. It belongs first to morning. So let us end this part of the journey with the image still alive in the mind. The sacred trees standing over temple ground. The sun just beginning to edge upward. The city holding its breath. The Bennu in the branches, blue and purple against the pale dawn. Gold at the crown, voice ready. Then the cry, and with it, the reminder that creation is not abandoned after the first act. It is tended, called back, renewed one morning at a time. And if a being can help guard the world every day, then perhaps it can also survive the greater turning of ages, where dawn becomes epoch, and the next mystery opens in flame. Now that the Bennu has taken its place in the sacred rhythm of dawn, the story begins to stretch outward into something much larger than a single morning, larger even than a single civilization watching the horizon. The bird that helps wake the world each day is also drawn into the deeper machinery of time itself. This is where the myth grows colder, stranger, and in some ways more beautiful. Because dawn is one thing, but a creature measured against the stars is something else entirely. Ancient Egyptian priests were not dreamy in the careless sense. They were imaginative, yes, but they were also watchful. They watched the river, the seasons, the fields, the moon, and above all the sky. They noticed when stars returned to particular positions. They noticed how calendars drifted and how cosmic order could be read in repeating patterns. So when the Bennu became associated with a great recurring cycle, this was not merely poetic decoration. It was a way of placing the sacred bird inside the vast architecture of the universe. The source script ties the Bennu to the Sothic cycle, a period of 461 years linked to the heliacal rising of Sirius and the long reset of the Egyptian calendar. Some scholars would phrase the relationship more carefully, and some of the exact ancient interpretations are debated. But the important thing for our story is clear. The Bennu is no longer only the bird of the first cry and the morning trees. It becomes a living timekeeper, a creature whose life is so long, so measured, so remote from ordinary mortality that human dynasties begin to feel like brief weather passing over stone. I have always found that shift haunting. It is one thing to imagine a sacred bird returning each dawn. It is another to imagine a single life stretching across more than a millennium, watching cities rise and wear down, watching priests become ancestors and their grandchildren become dust. The Bennu belongs to deep time. It carries patience the way mortal creatures carry breath. If you were standing in Heliopolis with me, not for one morning now, but over centuries in the strange way only myth allows, you would see the same bird return again and again to the sacred trees, while everything around it slowly changed. Stone repaired, walls extended, rulers renamed, ritual garments altered in subtle fashion, languages shifting their edges, yet the Bennu would remain the radiant constant in the pattern, the witness to time not as rush, but as immense rotation. And yet even such a being does not simply continue forever in one unbroken bodily form. This is where fire enters more fully. According to the sacred tradition preserved in the source, when the Bennu reaches the end of its appointed span, it does not die. as ordinary creatures die. No wasting illness. No collapse into the dust. No quiet vanishing into reeds and mud. Instead, it enters a ritual of renewal that mirrors the deeper laws of creation itself. The bird prepares for its own transformation. The ending of one life becomes the necessary door to the next. The image is solemn from the first step. The Bennu begins to gather materials, aromatic woods, resins, sacred substances, fragrant enough to belong to temple ritual rather than ordinary nest building. Even here, the bird remains unlike anything else in creation. It does not scratch together straw and broken twigs with the absent-minded efficiency of a common animal. It selects. It arranges. It prepares as though aware not only of death, but of the exact shape renewal must take. Picture that process slowly, because it deserves slowness. The light over Egypt is hot, pale, steady. The air smells faintly of dust and river, damp and leaves warmed by the sun. The Bennu moves through sacred groves and hidden places, choosing what it needs. A branch of one wood, a strip of bark rich with scent, a resin tear glinting amber in the light. It carries each piece with the same grave precision it once brought to the dawn. Nothing hurried, nothing careless. This is not panic in the face of ending. It is ceremony. Honestly, there is something almost unsettling in that calm. Human beings are not very good at endings, and most of us would rather fidget, deny, negotiate, or make a very poor joke at the wrong time. The Bennu does none of that. It prepares. The nest, or funeral pyre, begins to take form. Layer upon layer of fragrant material. Wood laid with intention. Resins tucked into the structure like hidden sparks waiting for their moment. Some later traditions will make this pyre more lavish and exotic than the older Egyptian material likely intended. But already the core idea is there. Fire and scent, death and offering, ending and return, woven together in one place. If you were standing close enough, you might smell sweetness in the air before you saw the finished structure. Resin warming in sunlight. Bark releasing its stored perfume. The breath of sap and spice mingling with the dryness of the day. The whole place would feel less like a grave and more like a threshold. That is one of the strangest qualities of the Bennu cycle. It refuses to let death have the final visual language. Even the place of ending is arranged as a chamber of transformation. Then comes the fire. The source describes the Bennu igniting itself in a burst of divine flame, consuming both bird and nest in a spectacular conflagration. Later Mediterranean traditions would become almost intoxicated by this scene, painting it larger and brighter and more theatrical. But even in its earlier form, it carries immense symbolic force. The bird of dawn now enters flame. The being of recurring light passes through a hotter kind of light. Fire here is not simple destruction. It is purification, concentration, release, a reducing down to what can be carried forward. The important thing is that the burning is not framed as tragedy. Not in the deepest sense. It is solemn, yes. It is final in one form, yes, but it is also expected, even celebrated as part of the continuity of divine life. The bird is not lost to meaning. It is fulfilling it, You know that feeling when autumn leaves burn in a pile somewhere far off, and the smell reaches you before the smoke is visible, and suddenly the season feels real in a new way. The Bennu fire is not like that in scale, of course, but it has a related emotional effect. It makes change undeniable. It makes time visible. It gathers an ending into the senses. Now imagine the pyre lit from within. The golden crest brighter than before. Wings folded. The structure catching. Flame taking hold first in the dry, fragrant edges, then rising inward. Smoke carrying resin and sweetness upward in layered ribbons. The bird's form still visible for a while through the glow, then less distinct, then only light, then ember, then ash. Not horror, not violence, just the severe beauty of one form being surrendered so another may come. And then, after flame, the waiting. That waiting matters. The story could have rushed from fire to rebirth as if transformation were a trick. But the old sacred imagination gives us ash first. Silence after brightness. A cooled space where form has been undone. I think that is wise. Renewal that means anything must pass through some region of stillness where the old shape is truly gone. Then the new Bennu emerges. Identical and not identical. The same being renewed. The same role restored. The same sacred pattern continued without interruption. This is where the myth folds mortality and immortality together in its own strange way. The bird dies. The bird returns. Identity survives through transformation. Time consumes, but also restores. The old life is not erased. It becomes the condition for the next one. That idea would become one of the most powerful mythic inheritances the Mediterranean world ever received. But in Egypt, it remains linked to cosmic order more than personal drama. The reborn Bennu does not step into the world as a rebellious exception to law. It is law, or at least one of the living signs that law still holds. The cycle repeats because the universe itself is cyclical. Dawn after night, flood after drought, season after season, life after apparent ending. The priests of Heliopolis, according to the source, kept records of these renewal patterns and read them in relation to larger historical and cosmic changes. The appearance of a newly reborn Bennu could be interpreted as an omen, especially at moments of dynastic transition or religious significance. Whether every such claim reflects literal ancient record or later elaboration is something scholars would discuss carefully. We cannot be sure how many layers of interpretation settled onto the myth over time. But again, the deeper point remains. The bird's renewal was never just private. It belonged to the life of the cosmos and the life of the kingdom alike. That is what gives the Bennu such unusual dignity. It is not merely a creature that escapes death. It is a being through whom the universe teaches its most persistent lesson. Destruction is not the whole story. Ash is not the whole story. Endings are real, but they are sometimes folded into a rhythm that exceeds the fear they provoke. I think that may be why the myth feels almost soothing, even when it grows darker. Fire is here. Yes. Loss of form is here. The long wait of time is here. Yet none of it is chaotic. The Bennu enters its ending the way dawn enters the horizon. with inevitability and composure. It knows the path, or at least the myth asks us to imagine that it does. And perhaps that imagination has comforted people for longer than we can properly measure. Because human beings are not strangers to smaller versions of this cycle. We watch years burn away. We lose names, homes, certainties, versions of ourselves. We stand in ash of one sort or another more often than we like to admit. The Bennu myth does not remove that reality. It gives it shape, a sacred one, a pattern in which what is most essential can pass through fire and return, not untouched, but renewed. Now let the image widen again. The sacred city waiting. Priests studying both stars and stories. The bird in the trees at dawn. The long count of years. The slow gathering of fragrant materials. The pyre. The blaze. The hush after. The renewed bird stepping once more into the pattern of morning. Day after day, age after age, the cosmic order remains held together by repetition, by return, by the refusal of creation to remain a single past event. The Bennu proves that the world is not merely made, but remade. Soon, though, this carefully balanced Egyptian vision will begin to travel. Foreign eyes will come. New ears will hear the story imperfectly. The name itself will shift in the mouth. The elegant heron of Heliopolis will begin to thicken into something brighter, stranger, more theatrical, more suited to Greek wonder and Mediterranean legend. The cycle of fire will remain, but its meaning will change. The old sacred bird will survive that transformation too, though not without losing some of its earliest subtleties. For now, though, let us remain one moment longer with the Egyptian bird of deep time, standing between ash and dawn. It has burned. It has returned. It has taken up again the work of waking the world. And across the horizon, already, ships and travelers and restless foreign minds are moving closer, carrying with them the next great alteration, when the Bennu will become the phoenix, and the calm keeper of cosmic order will be remade into a creature of rarer fire and louder legend. There is also a melancholy hidden in that cycle, and I think the Egyptians probably understood it well. Renewal is glorious, but it is not cheap. The same bird returns, yet each return asks for surrender first. Flame before morning, ash before song. The myth never lets us pretend continuity comes without cost. That may be why it feels mature rather than naive. It knows that what lasts does so by passing through loss again and again, and still consenting to begin. Stories rarely stay where they are born. They travel in the mouths of merchants, in the notebooks of historians, in the misunderstandings of curious foreigners, in the flattery of poets, and sometimes in the well-meaning hands of people who love what they are hearing just enough to change it forever. That is what happens next to the Bennu, the sacred Egyptian bird of dawn. Cosmic order and long-measured renewal does not remain enclosed within temple walls and priestly language. It drifts outward. It crosses into another imagination. And once it does, it begins to change. The 5th century before Christ is one of the turning points in the source script, because this is where Herodotus enters the story. He arrives in Egypt as a Greek traveler under Persian rule, curious, observant, eager, and like many travelers, before and after him, only partly aware of how much his own habits of thought are reshaping what he sees. I do not say that mockingly. It is simply what people do. We go abroad and imagine we are collecting facts, when often we are collecting translations of our own expectations. Herodotus listens to Egyptian priests, especially in places such as Heliopolis, where ancient solar traditions remain alive. He hears of the sacred bird, of its periodic renewal, of its relation to the sun and sacred cycles. And then he writes. But between what is said and what is recorded, something shifts. It always does. Part of the shift is linguistic. The word Bennu, tied in Egyptian to ideas of rising and shining, does not pass neatly into Greek ears. It becomes phoenix, a new name, a close enough sound, perhaps, but not a close enough meaning. The Greek word carries different associations, and once that happens, the bird is already beginning to slip free of its oldest theological roots. A name is never just a label. It is a lens. Change the name, and you begin changing the creature. The source points out another major alteration, the cycle itself. The Egyptian tradition tied the bird, in this retelling, to the 461-year Sothic cycle. But Herodotus records a much shorter span, 500 years. Some scholars argue this may reflect simplification, mistranslation, or the Greek desire for a cleaner, more narratively manageable interval. We cannot be sure. What matters for the story is that the cosmic timekeeper has begun shrinking into legend. Deep astronomical precision gives way to a rounder, more memorable number. And then comes the visual transformation, which I have always found both fascinating and a little sad. The old Bennu is graceful, heron-like, tied to dawn colors, blue, purple, gold, elegant rather than aggressive. The Greek phoenix becomes increasingly eagle-like in description. Broader wings, fiercer outline, stronger heroic posture. The color palette shifts too. Subtle dawn hues are pushed aside in favor of gold, red, and orange, colors that declare fire openly rather than suggesting its sacred restraint. Greek imagination, for all its brilliance, often preferred the dramatic. It wanted creatures that looked ready to stride into epic poetry. Honestly, you can almost watch the change happen. The Egyptian bird stands in temple light, calm and measured. The Greek version steps into a brighter stage, its edges sharpened, its flames more obvious, its uniqueness turned outward for an audience that loves spectacle. It is still the same story in one sense. The burning bird, the return, the sacred rarity. But it is no longer the same mood. The old serenity of cosmic maintenance begins giving way to the thrill of an extraordinary marvel. If you were standing there with me at the edge of that cultural handoff, perhaps in a temple court, where an Egyptian priest is trying to explain sacred tradition to a Greek listener whose imagination is already halfway to epic metaphor, you might feel the tension in the air. One mind is speaking in theological layers, in ritual symbols, in cosmic order. The other is hearing a wondrous bird that burns and returns and appears only rarely. Neither is entirely wrong. but they are not hearing the same creature. That difference deepens as the story moves further into Greek culture. The Greeks are not interested in the Bennu primarily as a daily participant in solar order. They are fascinated by rarity, by the dramatic self-burning, by the strange continuity of identity after destruction, by the omen-like quality of a creature that appears only at vast intervals and seems to step into human history from outside it. The bird becomes more singular, less woven into ordinary cosmic recurrence, more an event than a rhythm. And then geography begins to shift as well. The original Bennu belongs firmly to Egypt, especially to Heliopolis and its sacred trees. But Greek writers begin relocating the phoenix to more generalized, distant lands. Arabia, above all. Arabia, in Greek imagination, is fragrant, wealthy in spices, exotic, luminous with trade goods and dessert mystery. It is precisely the kind of place a fabulous reborn bird ought to inhabit if one wishes to make the story feel both ancient and sensuously vivid. The source spends a great deal of time on this, and I think the emphasis is revealing. Once the bird moves into Greek and later Mediterranean storytelling, Arabia becomes the land of aromatic woods, cinnamon, cassia, frankincense, myrrh, all the luxurious materials thought fitting for the phoenix's funeral pyre. This is no longer only a story about sacred time. It is also a story about distance, rarity, and expensive fragrance. The myth has put on perfume that is not merely decorative. It changes the emotional texture of the whole legend. In the Egyptian atmosphere, the sacred bird feels integrated into a temple world of stone, leaf, dawn, and ordered ritual. In the Greek and post-Greek atmosphere, the phoenix begins to feel more wandering, more singular, more like a radiant traveler from the far edge of the known world. Its home is no longer the stable center of a theology. It is the exotic elsewhere from which marvels arrive. The funeral pyre grows in extravagance too. Woods become rarer, spices more lavish, construction more elaborate, the bird's last song more dramatic, the self-immolation more emotionally gripping. Greek taste, and then later Roman and literary taste, pulls the story steadily toward the spectacular. I do not mean that as criticism alone. It is part of why the phoenix endured so vividly. But it is worth noticing what gets lost when spectacle grows. Subtle symbolic relationships, the relation to daily dawn, to sacred trees, to the calm maintenance of cosmic order. All of that dims a little. I have always found that loss almost moving in itself. Myths, like people, survive partly by changing, but survival through change is never cost-free. The Bennu becomes the phoenix by shedding some of its oldest colors. Greek religious syncretism accelerates all of this. During the Hellenistic Age, especially after Alexander, cultures mingle, blend, borrow, translate, and sometimes elegantly steal from one another. Egyptian religion becomes available to Greek thinkers in new ways, and Greek philosophical and poetic habits in turn reshape what they borrow. The phoenix proves irresistible because it can be fitted to Greek ideas about purification, singular marvels, divine signs, and individual transformation. This is another crucial shift. Egyptian thought emphasizes cosmic continuity, stable recurrence, order maintained through patterned return. Greek thought, especially in some philosophical and literary settings, becomes more interested in the phoenix as a symbol of personal transformation, spiritual change, or the extraordinary exception. The old bird of maintenance becomes a bird of metamorphosis. And so Greek artists change it too. They paint and imagine the creature with more heroic anatomy, more elaborate crests, wider wings, stronger talons, more overtly fiery plumage. The visual language follows Greek taste. The phoenix must look worthy of amazement, worthy of poetry, worthy of standing alongside griffins, sphinxes, and the other creatures that populate the shimmering edge between natural philosophy and marvel literature. The old heron's silhouette, elegant and sacred in Egypt, begins to seem insufficiently majestic for the Greek imagination. You know that feeling when someone retells a quiet story you loved, and somehow by the end there are more explosions, more speeches, and suspiciously better hair. That is not exactly what happens here, but it is not entirely unlike it either. Yet we should be fair. Greek transformation does not merely distort, it also preserves. Without Greek curiosity, however imperfect, the Bennu might have remained far more local in later memory. The phoenix survives globally because it was remade. The later world inherits the bird, not directly from Egyptian priesthood, but through layers of Greek fascination. Alteration becomes transmission. Loss becomes endurance of another kind. Still, the emotional center has changed. The bird is now rarer, more theatrical, more attached to wonder and omen than to daily sacred order. Its homeland has shifted toward aromatic distance. Its body has become more overtly martial and fiery. Its time cycle has become simpler. Its symbolism has begun to lean towards singular renewal rather than continuous maintenance. And once the Greeks have done this, the Romans will follow, and poets will take even greater liberties, and philosophers will climb inside the image and find in it meditations on identity, death, and the soul. But first, the bird must complete this first major migration, from temple theology into Mediterranean legend. If you were standing with me at sunset now, perhaps near a harbor where Egyptian goods, Arabian spices, and Greek stories move together in the same restless world, you could almost imagine the phoenix lifting out of this cultural crossing itself. No longer only Bennu, not yet everything it will become. A creature in transition, carrying Egyptian dawn in its bones, Greek fire in its feathers, and the first hint of a long afterlife in literature. That, perhaps, is the most phoenix-like thing the myth ever does. It is reborn not only in flame, but in interpretation. It passes through one civilization's understanding and rises again in another's. Similar, but altered. Luminous, but changed. The old sacred bird survives by entering foreign language and foreign longing. It loses some precision. It gains some reach. The result is the legend most of the world now remembers. Soon we will enter the fully developed phoenix of Arabia, of spices, of grand pyres, and impossible return, the bird that later literature adored. But before that next transformation begins, it is worth pausing here at this human threshold, where one culture listens to another and hears both a truth and a marvel, and in trying to preserve the story, creates a new one. The Bennu has crossed the water. The name has shifted. The dawn bird of Heliopolis is becoming the Firebird of legend, and the next time we meet it, it will burn in a way the old priests might recognize, yet hardly call their own. And somewhere in that transformation, one can feel the old Egyptian calm looking back almost wistfully from behind the brighter feathers. The Greek phoenix is magnificent, yes, but it is also louder, more solitary, more self-conscious in its marvel. The Bennu had belonged to a world of priests, dons, and recurring order. The phoenix begins to belong to travelers, storytellers, and audiences leaning forward for the extraordinary. Neither form is empty, but they are not the same kind of sacredness. Maybe that is the fate of every enduring myth. It survives by accepting misunderstanding as the price of travel. A story carried far enough will inevitably be dressed in foreign colors, given new accents, and asked to answer questions it was not originally born to answer. The wonder is not that the Bennu changed. The wonder is that beneath all the additions, the core image still remained recognizable. A radiant bird, a fire, an ending, a return. By the time the phoenix settles fully into the Greek and later Mediterranean imagination, it has become a creature almost too elaborate for the ordinary world to contain. The old Egyptian Bennu had stood in sacred trees at dawn, calm as theology, precise as ritual, woven into the daily breathing of the cosmos. The later phoenix still carries a memory of that sacred depth, but it now wears richer colors, stranger geography, and a much more theatrical loneliness. It has moved outward into Arabia, into spice and distance, into the sort of landscape that ancient listeners loved because it sounded both real and impossible at once. Arabia, in these later tellings, is less a careful map than a shimmering edge of the known world. It is the land from which perfumes arrive, where merchants tell stories that grow more luminous with each retelling, where woods are rare, resins expensive, and every wind seems to carry some sweetness too old for names. The source script leans deeply into that atmosphere, and I think it does so for a reason. Once the bird is relocated from Heliopolis to Arabia, the myth stops feeling like a daily temple truth and starts feeling like an event one might travel a lifetime to glimpse. And there, in that warm, severe country of resin and glare, the phoenix begins its final preparations. This is the phase of the story that later writers adored, because it gives them everything: luxury, ritual, flame, fragrance, loss, spectacle, and return. But I think it only works if we keep its slowness. If we rush it, it becomes fantasy wallpaper. If we slow down, it becomes strange again. Picture the bird moving through the Arabian landscape with grave purpose. The sun is hard above the desert. Light spills across stone and sand until both seem to vibrate with heat. Somewhere in a high valley, cassia bark dries in the wind. Somewhere else, cinnamon branches hold their scent beneath thin, papery skins. Frankincense gathers in pale tears along cut bark. Myrrh darkens in rough, glistening drops. The phoenix does not seize these things randomly. It selects. It measures. It knows what must be gathered and what must be left behind. I have always liked that detail. Even in legends, sacred work usually involves choosing. The bird's body, as later sources imagine it, is larger now than the old heron-like Bennu. More eagle-like, more commanding. 4 or 5 feet in height when upright, perhaps with a wingspan broad enough to make the air feel occupied before the bird even lands. Its feathers blaze with gold and crimson. Its crest does not merely shine now. It seems to burn. Its eyes carry a brightness that ancient writers never quite managed to describe without reaching for metal. Fire, dawn, or lightning. Every culture that touched the bird made it a little more excessive, which is very human. Give us one sacred creature, and in 3 generations we have added jewels, weather systems, and at least one very dramatic entrance. Still, beneath the embellishment, the mood remains solemn. The phoenix is approaching the end of its cycle, and the end is not random. It comes with timing. The source describes calculations, celestial intervals, and the sense that the bird enters its transformation only when the larger rhythm of the cosmos has aligned. Death here is not interruption. It is appointment. So the nest is built. Not a common nest. Never a common nest. A funeral pyre constructed with the care of an architect and the reverence of a priest. Cassia forms the foundation. Sandalwood appears, and aloe wood, and carefully placed resins. Frankincense, bright and clean. Myrrh, darker, more bitter, more grave. The source makes the structure almost geometrical, as if the bird understands proportion better than men who draft temples. It is an image ancient listeners would have loved. Nature's surpassing craftsmanship. Instinct revealing hidden mathematics. If you were standing there with me, close enough to smell, but not close enough to interfere, the first impression would probably be fragrance. Sweetness, resin, sap, warm bark, bitter undertones from myrrh, the dry clarity of desert air threading through it all. It would not smell like a grave. It would smell like a sanctuary. That may be the point. The phoenix never really gives death the last aesthetic word. Even its ending smells prepared for sanctity. The nest grows wider, denser, more intricate. 12 feet across in some tellings, with careful layers and channels for air. So the fire, when it comes, will move evenly. The bird places each piece with the same assurance it must once have brought to dawn in the old myth. One branch, then another. A curl of bark, a pocket of resin, a chamber of scent. I think this is one of those places where the story becomes almost hypnotic, if told properly. Repetition, selection, arrangement, the slow making of the place where one life will end and another begin. Then the phoenix settles into the center, not in fear, not in reluctance. That is what makes the scene so unnerving and so beautiful. It does not resist its own transformation. It enters it. Wings fold. Crest brightens. The body becomes still enough that the whole desert around it seems to lean in. Ancient witnesses, or at least ancient writers imagining witnesses, say the bird sings then. A final song, Some describe it as sweeter than any nightingale, stronger than any eagle, layered with harmonics beyond ordinary hearing. The source leans hard into the supernatural acoustics of that song, and rightly so. If this bird is going to ignite itself by voice, the song cannot be merely lovely. It has to sound like a threshold opening. You know that feeling when a note in music vibrates so clearly that the room seems to change shape around it. Imagine that, but magnified until bark trembles and resin wakes and air itself feels charged. The phoenix sings, and the pyre answers. Fire begins. Not all at once. Perhaps a bright burst in the resin. White flame through frankincense. Amber through cassia. Gold threading up the cinnamon branches. Then darker tones from myrrh. Deeper, stranger, more mysterious. The source describes the blaze in layers of color, which feels exactly right. This is not ordinary combustion. It is coded fire, ritual fire. Fire that seems to know what it is for. For 3 days and 3 nights in the source, the conflagration continues. The nest does not collapse into disorder. The heat remains contained. The air around the pyre shimmers, but the fire does not spread wild into the desert. Even the destruction keeps its boundaries. I think that detail matters, because this is never the chaos of mere burning. It is transformation under law. Wild creatures flee the area. Human onlookers, if any dare remain, are overwhelmed by scent and light. Some later stories say the smoke induces visions. I can believe the ancients would imagine such a thing. Stand near enough to a sacred fire fed on resin and myth and expectation, and the mind will begin seeing more than it usually does. Flame has always been good at pulling hidden shapes out of us. Then at last the fire dies down. Ash remains. Bone fragments, perhaps. Heat still trembling in the air. The great bird is gone, if gone is the right word. And now comes one of the strangest details in the entire legend, one the source preserves in full. The first form to emerge is not a young phoenix in miniature, not a neat and glorious bird stepping instantly out of cinders like a stage illusion. It is a small worm, or grub, no larger than a thumb. Honestly, I love how weird that is. It saves the story from becoming too polished. Myth is often at its best when it refuses elegance at exactly the right moment. The little larval creature shines with an opalescent sheen in some accounts, rainbow hints moving across its body as it stirs among the ashes. It feeds on the remains of its predecessor. That detail may sound bleak if said too quickly, but in the logic of the myth, it is intimate rather than cruel. The old life becomes the nourishment of the new. Essence passing forward through contact. The continuation is not abstract. It is material. Day by day, the tiny creature changes. Segments give way to form. Wings begin as suggestions. The body lengthens. Feathers emerge. The colors return gradually, first pale, then deepening, then igniting. Gold at the edges, crimson in the breast and wings, the crest lifting again like remembered fire. In time, the phoenix stands renewed, not a descendant, not exactly an offspring, but the same sacred pattern alive again. And still the story is not finished. Because in many later versions, including the source we are following, the reborn bird now undertakes a pilgrimage. It gathers the ashes and bone fragments of its predecessor into a specially formed container, a myrrh egg. That image is one of the most arresting in the whole legend. The bird carrying its former self as burden, relic, and inheritance all at once. Renewal does not forget what came before. It bears it. The making of the myrrh egg is described with elaborate care. The finest myrrh is purified, softened, shaped into a perfect ovoid vessel. The remains are arranged inside. Larger fragments first, finer ash afterward, the heart placed near the center in some accounts. The whole object is then sealed and made ready for flight. It is part reliquary, part womb, part tomb carried into the sky. Then the phoenix rises, the flight from Arabia back toward Egypt, back toward Heliopolis, is not a practical migration. It is ceremonial. The source makes it almost cosmic, with the bird tracing aerial routes aligned to stars and ancient pathways in the heavens. Temple bells ring beneath it. Priests observe strange lights. The phoenix returns not simply to a destination, but to an origin. That matters. The later Firebird, for all its Arabian perfume and Greek drama, still bends back toward Egypt in the end. The myth remembers where it first learned to rise. If you were watching it pass overhead, you might see a streak of gold and red against the daylight, too bright to stare at comfortably. You might hear the wing beats, not merely as sound, but as tone, almost musical. Below, rivers move, deserts widen, cities age, dynasties swap names and gods, and above them the same old bird carries its own remains home. That is a remarkable image if you sit with it long enough. The myth is no longer just about defying death. It is about carrying memory through transformation. The new bird is not empty of the old one. It is built from it, burdened by it, faithful to it. Soon this phoenix will move out of sacred ritual and into public history, or at least into stories told as history, where its appearances will mark kings, wars, plagues, fires, dynastic endings, and the slow unease of empires. But before it becomes omen, it is this: a creature of spice, geometry, fire, ash, larval mystery, and return, crossing the sky with a myrrh egg held close, as though the past must be transported carefully if the future is to mean anything. And perhaps that is why this part of the myth survives so vividly. It takes the old Egyptian idea of renewal and gives it textures the human imagination can hardly resist. Heat, scent, music, flame, ash, flight. The result is extravagant. Yes, maybe even a little overdressed in places, but it never loses the old pulse underneath. Endings are real. They burn. They leave remains. Yet the story insists, almost stubbornly, that remains are enough. Enough for return. Enough for continuity. Enough to build one more dawn from what looked like a finished fire. Once the phoenix has been given its Arabian distances, its fragrant pyre, its impossible return, it becomes something more than a sacred creature and more than a literary marvel. It becomes an omen, a witness, a messenger that appears, or is said to appear, at the edges of great change. This is where the legend leaves the privacy of ritual and enters the public stage of history, or perhaps what human beings like to call history when they are trying to give mystery a more official hat. The source script follows this transformation with real enthusiasm. The phoenix no longer belongs only to priests, or to rare desert preparations beyond human sight. It begins to appear around dynasties, monumental building projects, wars, imperial transitions, plagues, fires, and the great uneasy turning points where a civilization suspects something larger than politics may be watching. Whether every one of these accounts reflects literal ancient record, embellished memory, symbolic storytelling, or later invention, dressed in antique robes, is very much open to debate. Some scholars are cautious, and wisely so. But for the purposes of the mythic story, the pattern matters more than strict verification. The phoenix appears when the world is about to change. In Egypt, one of the earliest examples in the source is tied to the age of pyramid building. During the reign of Djoser, when the step pyramid rose at Saqqara and Imhotep's architectural imagination began reshaping the horizon, the phoenix is said to have appeared at Heliopolis. I find that pairing almost perfect. A civilization learning to build upward in stone beneath the gaze of a bird that already belongs to deep time. The human project is ambitious, geometric, determined to resist decay. The bird embodies renewal that no stone can fully trap. Picture the scene: workers hauling, measuring, setting blocks in heat that seems to flatten the day. Dust everywhere, fine as flour on the skin. Priests in the sacred precincts watching dawn, reading signs, listening for what does not belong to ordinary mornings. Then the appearance: the bird in the sacred grove, crest bright against the horizon, remaining not for a moment, but for days. Pilgrims come. Whispers spread. It is not hard to see why people would read such a thing as approval, or warning, or both at once. Humans love to believe heaven is paying attention when they are building something large enough to be remembered. The source goes further, describing multiple phoenix appearances during the age of Khufu and the Great Pyramid, even suggesting simultaneous manifestations across temple sites. That detail feels very much like legend growing in confidence, and perhaps that is exactly what it is. But what a vivid piece of legend it is. The thought of several phoenix forms blazing above Egypt while the greatest stone monument of the ancient world takes shape. The sky and the desert, both occupied by immensities. Men below pulling limestone into alignment. Birds above, tracing a different geometry in light. I have always thought it telling that the phoenix appears so often near acts of human permanence. Pyramids, thrones, dynasties, cities. It is as though the legend keeps asking the same quiet question. You wish to endure. Yes, but do you understand what endurance costs? From Egypt, the omen pattern widens into the Greek world. The source places a major phoenix sighting over the Battle of Salamis during the Persian Wars. Whether one reads that as historical belief, literary patriotism, or sacred retrofitting after the fact, it is a striking image. Athens under threat. The Persian fleet vast on the water. The fate of the Greek city states uncertain. And above that sea battle, the bird. If you were standing with me on the heights above the harbor, you would see the water flashing in hard light, hear the distant collision of oars and shouted orders, smell salt and smoke and fear. Then high above the confusion, a streak of gold and crimson circling, where no ordinary bird could hold such command. The source says its song was heard even over the battle. Perhaps that is poetic excess. Perhaps not. Ancient writers were not always interested in the line between what happened and what ought to have happened in the telling. Either way, the function is clear. The phoenix becomes a sign that history is not merely blind force. It has witnesses. It may even have judgment. In the Roman world, this role grows even stronger. The source gives us phoenix appearances around Augustus, Tiberius, Nero, and great imperial transitions. There is something very Roman in that. Rome wanted signs. Rome wanted cosmic endorsement. Rome wanted the heavens, when possible, to behave like a respectable senate and confirm the legitimacy of power. The phoenix was too useful a symbol not to be invited into that theater. One of the most compelling scenes in the source places the bird at Augustus's villa during his final illness, keeping vigil outside the chamber for 3 days. That is a marvelous detail. The first emperor dying inside, the bird of renewal waiting outside. It reads like a funeral poem written by the sky. The message could be taken many ways. End of one age, passage of a soul, transfer of sanction, or simply the old mythic reassurance that death, even imperial death, does not exhaust the order of things. Then under Tiberius, the phoenix becomes an object of more formal inquiry. Tacitus, as the source later notes, treats such reports with measured skepticism. The skeptical historian's version of saying, "This is fascinating, but I am not going to embarrass myself in public just yet." That, too, I find endearing. Even the Roman administrator can only maintain so much dryness when confronted with a self-renewing solar bird. And then, inevitably, Nero. The source describes ominous phoenix appearances before the great fire of Rome, with darker coloration, harsher song, more agitated flight. This is where the legend reveals another side. The phoenix is not always a herald of victory or legitimate succession. Sometimes it warns. Sometimes it appears where destruction is coming, not to prevent it, but to mark it. That feels truer to the deeper myth. I think fire is part of the bird's own life. Why would it not appear where cities too are about to burn? Imagine Rome before the fire. Heat trapped in walls. Narrow streets thick with rumor. Power unstable under polished surfaces. Then scattered sightings. The strange bird on a rooftop at dawn. A light too vivid in the distance. A note in the air that people cannot place. And later, when the city burns, the source gives us the phoenix flying directly through the flames. It is an almost unbearable image, beautiful and grim together. A creature of regenerative fire moving through civic catastrophe, as if to say that destruction is never innocent. But neither is it always final. The omen pattern extends beyond courts and battles into natural disaster. The source gives phoenix sightings before earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and plague outbreaks. Again, Some of this is almost certainly the work of later interpretive tradition. Communities looking backward through disaster and finding symbols that might make the suffering legible. But that backward reading is itself part of myth-making. People do not endure catastrophe on facts alone. They search for pattern, even if the pattern is stitched after the wound. Take the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. As the source does, before the mountain breaks open and buries Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash, phoenix sightings are said to occur throughout the Bay of Naples. Here the symbolism writes itself. A bird of fire and ash, appearing before one of antiquity's great ash falls. The sky darkening, the ground trembling. People trying to go on with ordinary errands, while the deep machinery of the earth prepares its terrible argument. Then the bird, perhaps crossing above the bay like a warning no one quite knows how to read in time. Or plague. The source describes mournful phoenix manifestations before epidemic outbreaks. Their songs altered, their light dimmer, their presence somehow more sorrowful than triumphant. That is an unusually tender variation in the legend. The bird no longer simply predicts. It grieves in advance. It keeps vigil before mass suffering. I think that is why these stories endured. They let the natural world itself respond to human pain. Not with indifference, but with omen and witness. The universe notices. The legend says, the sky does not shrug. You know that feeling when something terrible is coming, and the world seems to know before you do. Dogs uneasy, air strange, light wrong somehow. These phoenix omens are that feeling given form and wings. And then there are dynastic endings. Cleopatra, Actium, the shifting of Egypt into Roman control. The source gives the phoenix here too, appearing above a world where old orders are being folded into new ones. That is one of the most fitting uses of the symbol. The phoenix is not merely a bird of cheerful rebirth. It is a bird of transition through loss. It belongs where one world burns into another. Picture the Mediterranean at Actium. Oars beating. Tension thick as rope. Standards bright in the harsh light. Antony and Cleopatra's fate hanging over the sea. Then above the battle, the bird, not choosing serenity over history, but entering history at its most charged moment. The source imagines its flight eventually shifting toward Octavian's victorious side, a neat, symbolic transfer of divine favor. Whether that detail began as propaganda, retrospective theology, or literary embroidery, it makes sense within the legend. The phoenix always seems to hover where continuity and rupture kiss. I think that is why rulers wanted it and feared it at the same time. A phoenix sighting could dignify a reign, sanctify a succession, bless a monumental project. But it could also imply that your empire had reached the point where only fire and renewal remained possible. Not exactly the sort of omen one wants embroidered on a banquet cushion. By now the bird has become almost a universal atmospheric witness. It circles over armies, lingers near dying rulers, glows above temple precincts, moves through the smoke of cities, appears before mountain eruptions and outbreaks of disease. It is less tied to one religious center and more to the broader human condition of living inside unstable history while longing for signs that instability itself may yet belong to a larger order. And that, perhaps, is the deepest meaning of these omen stories. Whether every account is factual is almost beside the point. The legend teaches people how to feel about great turning points, not as mere accidents, not as events sealed off from sacred significance, but as moments in which destruction and renewal are dangerously close together. The phoenix does not erase the suffering. It places it in a larger frame. Soon the myth will move inward again, into literature, philosophy, mystery cults, and the long work of poets and thinkers who make the bird speak about soul, ampere, identity, immortality, and spiritual rebirth. But before we enter scrolls and schoolrooms, I wanted to stay here a little while longer in the public weather of the legend, where the phoenix belongs to rooftops, battlefields, imperial gardens, and frightened cities waiting for the next dawn. The image that lingers for me is not one single apparition, but a sequence. The bird in Heliopolis while pyramids rise. The bird above Salamis. The bird near Augustus's chamber. The bird in the smoke of Rome. The bird before plague. Different skies. Different empires. Different meanings. Yet always the same old shape, gold and crimson against the unsettled air, appearing where history is about to admit that permanence was never as secure as it pretended to be. And perhaps that is why the myth remains powerful even now. We still want witnesses when the world changes. We still want signs that collapse is not empty, that endings may conceal a pattern we cannot yet read. The phoenix in these omen tales does not tell us everything will be fine. Ancient myths are usually too intelligent for that. It tells us something quieter, and perhaps more useful. Fire has meaning. Rupture is not random, and if an age is ending, something may already be gathering in the ash, preparing, however slowly, to rise. After all those appearances above battlefields, palaces, sacred groves, and frightened cities, the phoenix enters a quieter and in some ways more enduring kingdom, the kingdom of writing. That may sound less dramatic than a bird crossing a sky filled with smoke, but stories can outlive empires more efficiently than armies ever do. Once the phoenix settles into poetry, philosophy, and the long patient work of scribes, it becomes something harder to extinguish. A city can burn. A dynasty can fail. A temple can collapse into sand. But a symbol copied onto scroll after scroll acquires a second sort of immortality. This is where the bird becomes less a witnessed marvel and more a thought form, something writers and thinkers turn in the light, studying it from different angles to see what it might say about death, memory, power, identity, and the strange human wish to outlast the body. The source script moves here through a series of classical names: Ovid, Pliny, Tacitus, and then onward into philosophy and mystery religion. That sequence matters because each writer keeps the bird, but each one changes what the bird is for. Ovid is perhaps the easiest place to feel the transformation. In his hands, the phoenix becomes exquisitely literary, not merely a sacred creature reported by priests or travelers, but a polished emblem of metamorphosis itself. That makes sense. Ovid loved transformation, not just as an event, but as a principle. The world is a place where forms slide into other forms, where identity survives in altered shape, where beauty and ruin often touch. The phoenix fits that imagination almost too perfectly. If you were sitting with me in a Roman room lit by oil lamps, listening to a cultivated voice recite Ovid aloud while the evening gathers against the shutters. You would feel at once that the bird has changed atmospheres again. We are no longer in the temple courtyards of Heliopolis, and not quite in the omen-filled public square either. We are in art, in language made conscious of its own elegance. The phoenix appears not just as a creature, but as a carefully placed note in a poem about becoming. Every detail glows more. The feathers are richer, the woods more luxurious, the fire more emotionally charged. The bird is not being observed now. It is being arranged. And yet something essential survives the arrangement. Ovid understands that the emotional core of the story lies in the paradox that identity can pass through destruction without being annulled by it. The phoenix dies, and yet is itself again, not merely replaced. Continued. That idea would haunt literature for centuries, because it gives form to a question human beings never stop asking. What of me can survive the things that undo me? Pliny the Elder handles the bird differently. His instinct is not first poetic, but encyclopedic. He wants to know what exists in the world, or at least what people say exists in the world, and to place it within the great cabinet of natural history. There is something charming about that. A man hears of a self-renewing solar bird and thinks, yes, let us put that near the chapter on animals and see what can be done. The Roman mind could be wonderfully practical even when facing marvels. Still, Pliny's version matters because it nudges the phoenix towards something like managed curiosity. He does not entirely surrender to myth, but neither does he dismiss it out of hand. He measures, he compares, he reports cycles, he notes appearance, he records what others have claimed. In doing so, he helps preserve the bird in a register halfway between marvel and scholarship. The phoenix is now something one might discuss with the same earnest seriousness one applies to gemstones, rivers, elephants, eclipses, or odd customs from distant provinces. Tacitus adds yet another texture. He is wary, more political, more alert to the ways stories can be used, misused, staged, and interpreted for convenience. In his hands, Phoenix reports sit closer to imperial administration, rumor, witness testimony, and the unstable border between belief and usefulness. That is profoundly Roman in the darker sense. By the time Tacitus writes, everything public has become shadowed by power. A sign in the sky is never only a sign in the sky. It may also be propaganda, anxiety, or retrospective decoration applied to events people wish had possessed greater meaning. And still, Tacitus records it. That matters. Even skepticism, when it bothers to preserve a thing, becomes one more vehicle of survival. What fascinates me most here is not merely that different writers treat the phoenix differently, but that the bird remains recognizable beneath all these treatments. Poetic, scholarly, skeptical, symbolic, it survives them all. It is almost as if the myth performs its own lesson inside literature. It dies into one form and rises in another. The source then moves into mystery religions and philosophy, and this is where the bird becomes inward. Less public omen, more spiritual diagram, less a sign above kings, more a key for souls. That shift makes perfect sense. Once a culture has a symbol powerful enough to hold death and renewal together without collapsing into nonsense, philosophers and religious teachers are going to borrow it. Of course they are. It is simply too useful. One can place the phoenix at the center of initiation, transformation, purification, immortality, and the soul's continuity beyond bodily change, and it will behave itself beautifully. In mystery cult settings, the bird becomes a model of passage, initiates entering hidden rites, descending into underground chambers, moving through symbolic death toward symbolic rebirth, would have found in the phoenix a vivid image for what they hoped their own souls might undergo. A person enters as one thing and emerges as another, yet remains somehow themselves. That is very close to the spiritual dream many such cults sold. Though I say sold without meanness, human beings have always been willing to pay, in coin, obedience, secrecy, or endurance, for the hope that mortality is not the final grammar of existence. Imagine one of those initiation spaces, dim, enclosed, smelling faintly of incense, damp stone, and extinguished lamps. A guide speaks softly. A candidate waits, not fully understanding what they are about to be asked to feel. Above them, on a painted wall perhaps, or in a whispered myth repeated before the rite, the phoenix appears, not in Arabia this time, not over Rome, in the chamber of the mind. Burn what must be burned. Let what is false fall away. There is another life on the other side of this one. No wonder the image endured. The Orphic and related traditions would find in the phoenix a companion for ideas about the soul's long journey. Death, not as extinction, but as transition. Identity preserved through change. Platonic thinkers, too, could use the bird, because it helped make visible the otherwise abstract problem of continuity. How can a being change utterly and remain itself? The phoenix says, by passing through fire without surrendering essence. Stoic thinkers found a different use. For them, there was something admirable in the bird's acceptance of its own cycle. No panic, no complaint, no clinging. It enters destruction because destruction is part of the order of things, and in doing so becomes an emblem of cooperation with the deeper law of the cosmos. Honestly, that feels like exactly the kind of lesson a Stoic would admire, and exactly the kind of lesson a tired modern person might also admire, while still hoping not to be tested on it personally. The source also points toward hermetic and alchemical readings. That is another natural development. Once you have a creature that burns and returns purer, brighter, and somehow more fully itself, alchemists are going to look at it and think, yes, this will do very nicely. The phoenix becomes a symbol of transmutation, of matter made subtle, of corruption passing through the furnace into higher form. The funeral pyre starts to resemble the alchemical vessel. Ash becomes not waste, but residue of process. The bird stands for the dream that nature itself, and perhaps the human soul as well, can be refined through ordeal. There is something very human in all these appropriations. Every tradition that inherits the phoenix pulls it toward its own deepest questions. Poets ask, what survives transformation? Philosophers ask how identity persists. Mystery cults ask how the soul might be reborn. Alchemists ask what hidden perfection fire can reveal. The bird answers everyone in a slightly different accent, which is part of its genius. And then, in late antiquity, another great shift begins. Christian writers, inheriting the classical world while also arguing with it, encounter the phoenix and realize almost immediately that this old pagan bird could be useful. At first, there is caution. Naturally, the new religion is suspicious of inherited symbols that carry too much devotional baggage. But the resemblance is simply too tempting. A being that dies and rises. A being whose renewal offers assurance that life can emerge after apparent finality. A being whose very existence seems to mock the arrogance of the grave. It is difficult to imagine early Christian thinkers not leaning toward it eventually. So the phoenix enters Christian imagination, not as a god, not as an independent sacred force, but as a figure, a shadow, a natural emblem of resurrection. Clement of Rome is often mentioned here, and later fathers too, because they use the bird as illustrative material. Look, they say, in effect, even the natural world, or at least the stories the world preserves, contains hints that renewal after death is not inconceivable. The phoenix becomes a sermon in feathers. What matters in this new setting is not strict belief in the literal bird. It is usefulness. The phoenix helps bridge worlds. It allows Christian thinkers to speak across the gap between pagan inheritance and Christian doctrine. It offers a recognizable old symbol reinterpreted toward a new center. Its fire can now point toward Christ's triumph over death, or toward the resurrection of believers, or toward the soul's purification. Once again, the bird dies into one meaning and rises in another. I find that continuity strangely moving. The Egyptian dawn bird, the Greek firebird, the Roman imperial bird, the philosophical bird, the initiatory bird, the Christian emblem, all of them different, all of them related. It is not a tidy lineage, and some scholars would rightly object to any version that makes the transition look too smooth. These are not beads on a single string. They are layers, revisions, collisions, reinterpretations. Still, the persistence of the bird itself is undeniable. If you were to spread all those texts before us now, papyrus, parchment, scroll, codex, copied centuries apart by different hands in different moods and under different heavens, you would see the same shape flickering through them all. Sometimes formal, sometimes ornate, sometimes suspiciously grand, sometimes almost modest, but always carrying the old formula: fire, ending, return. And that may be the deepest point of this part of the story. The phoenix is no longer tied to one shrine, one city, one priesthood, or even one theology. It has become a vehicle for civilization-wide reflection on how anything survives. How memory survives empire. How essence survives change. How the self survives ordeal. How culture survives its own burning. Soon, in the final movement, the bird will widen again. It will be set beside other immortal birds: Simurgh, Garuda, Thunderbird, Fenghuang, and then it will pass fully into late antique and medieval afterlife as a symbol that outlives the ancient world that shaped it. But for now, let us pause among the scrolls The lamp is low. Ink dries on copied lines. The bird no longer circles above palaces. It now lives in books, which may be the most phoenix-like transformation of all. A creature once seen in sacred groves now surviving in the minds of readers, burning quietly in language, waiting to rise each time someone opens the page and lets it breathe again. By the time the ancient world begins to dim into late antiquity, the phoenix has already survived more transformations than most empires ever manage. It has risen from primordial Egyptian water, stood in sacred trees at dawn, burned in Arabian perfume, flown across the pages of Greek and Roman writers, hovered over dynastic change, and entered philosophy, mystery religion, and Christian symbolism. At this point, the bird is no longer just a mythological creature. It has become a pattern of thought, a durable shape into which civilization keeps pouring its deepest hopes. And that is why the final movement of the story feels so wide. The source script opens the horizon here, placing the phoenix beside other immortal or cosmic birds from cultures far beyond Egypt and Greece. The Persian simurgh, the Indian Garuda, the thunderbird of indigenous North American traditions, the Chinese feng huang. Some of these connections reflect actual ancient exchange, and some are looser resonances shaped by the universal human desire to imagine wings large enough to carry transcendence. Scholars debate how directly some of these traditions touch one another, and wisely so. We should be careful. But even careful comparison reveals something worth lingering over. Human beings across very different worlds kept imagining birds that mediated between heaven and earth, between death and continuity, between danger and renewal. The Persian simurgh, for example, feels at once like kin and not kin. It is older, wiser, less trapped by the cycle of burning and return, more mountainous, more maternal in certain tellings, and filled with cosmic knowledge. If the phoenix is a flame of recurrence, the simurgh is a great old intelligence with feathers. Yet both belong to the threshold between mortality and something larger. Both are keepers of continuity. Both suggest that wisdom may descend with wings. Garuda, in Hindu tradition, shifts the register again. Here, the bird becomes warrior, mount, servant of divine purpose, enemy of serpents, mover through cosmic scale with impossible speed. This is not the self-burning Mediterranean phoenix. Not exactly. Yet the family resemblance remains in the grandeur, the solar association, the role as mediator between worlds. One feels in Garuda the same old human intuition that bird form can carry divinity without being diminished by it. Then there is the thunderbird, huge, weather-making, full of storm power, capable of splitting the sky with its presence. It belongs to a very different environment, different spiritual assumptions, different histories, and still, at the level of feeling, there is kinship. A magnificent bird tied to forces greater than ordinary human control, appearing where nature and spirit refuse to be separated. The phoenix burns, the thunderbird storms, yet both insist that the world is more alive, more communicative, and more charged with meaning than a merely mechanical universe would allow. The Chinese feng huang, perhaps the most exquisite comparison of all, offers another variation on the same deep impulse. It is not just a bird of rebirth, but of virtue, harmony, legitimate rule, and cosmic balance. Paired often with imperial symbolism, it appears where order and rightful authority align. In that sense, it comes curiously close to the old Egyptian Bennu, not the later dramatic phoenix of pyres and ash, but the earlier sacred bird tied to rightness, rhythm, and the maintenance of a world properly ordered. I think that is one of the loveliest discoveries in the whole comparative section. The more the story widens, the more the phoenix seems to split into its older selves. In Persia, it becomes wisdom. In India, force and devotion. In North America, storm power and protective presence. In China, harmony and virtuous order. It is as though the one bird we have been following all night keeps reminding us that it was never only one thing to begin with. And perhaps that is where the deepest truth lies, not in proving that every immortal bird tradition came from one original source, because history is rarely so obliging, but in recognizing that civilizations, when left alone long enough with sky, mortality, memory, and imagination, often dream in similar directions. We want creatures that rise higher than we can. We want signs that the boundary between worlds is permeable. We want a form of life that does not treat death as the final authority. The source also follows the phoenix through the later philosophical and theological afterlife of antiquity. This matters because symbols become most powerful when they can survive the collapse of the worlds that first produced them. Egypt falls under foreign rule, and then under Rome. Greece becomes memory and canon. Rome itself fractures. Temples are emptied. Languages shift. Libraries are lost, copied, scattered, translated. Through all of that, the phoenix remains. That endurance is not accidental. The bird has become perfectly suited to ages of transition. Late antique and medieval Christian writers keep it alive because it can still point toward resurrection. Moralists keep it alive because it can still symbolize the soul emerging purified after ordeal. Rulers keep it alive because it can still flatter power with the suggestion of dynastic renewal. Alchemists keep it alive because it burns exactly as they want matter to burn, not into nothing, but into transfigured potential. Poets keep it alive because honestly, a self-renewing bird with gold and crimson feathers is far too good to waste. I have always found it almost funny, in a gentle way, that no one seems willing to leave the poor bird alone. Every era drapes something else over it. Theology, philosophy, politics, empire, eschatology. Self-help would probably have gotten there too if antiquity had printed paperbacks. And yet the phoenix somehow survives all these uses without becoming empty. That is the mark of a truly durable symbol. It can be handled repeatedly and still remain alive. The source's final argument, whether stated directly or not, is that the phoenix never really died because it was never just a creature. It was always a vessel, a shape into which cultures could pour their fears and hopes about endings. That is why it keeps returning. Not because a literal bird is somewhere arranging aromatic sticks in a distant valley, though it is pleasant to imagine, but because the pattern itself answers something urgent in human life. We live among things that end. Bodies, cities, languages, loves, regimes, certainties, even the stars, given enough time, do not remain exactly as they were. The phoenix becomes powerful because it does not deny ending. It enters it. It burns. It becomes ash. It allows real loss. But then it says, with a stubbornness that borders on tenderness, this is not all. That may be why the symbol grows even more compelling in periods of civilizational stress. When worlds are stable, people admire the phoenix. When worlds are collapsing, they need it. The bird says that continuity is possible without pretending nothing has been destroyed. It says renewal is real, but costly. It says form can perish and meaning endure. It says the future may carry the past, not by preserving its exact body, but by gathering its essence and rising under a changed sky. If you were standing with me now, at the far end of this long mythic road, not in Egypt anymore, not in Rome, not in a philosopher's school, but at the edge where the ancient world passes into all the worlds that come after it, you would see how strange the bird has become. It is no longer only painted on temple walls or whispered in one city's rites. It now lives in manuscripts, in sermons, in emblem books, in royal devices, in alchemical diagrams, in poems, in children's stories, in political speeches, in ordinary speech. When someone says, "from the ashes," and half forgets, they are invoking one of the oldest sacred creatures ever imagined. That is immortality of a kind, maybe the truest kind available to myths. And still, beneath all the later uses, I think the oldest image remains the most haunting. Dark water, the first cry, dawn in Heliopolis. A bird with blue-purple plumage and a golden crest, helping the world begin again. The later pyres, spices, imperial omens, philosophical glosses, and Christian metaphors are all real parts of the story. But they are layers. Deep under them, the first Bennu still waits in the reeds of imagination, reminding us that the phoenix began not as a theatrical defiance of death, but as a sacred participant in the first emergence of order from chaos. Perhaps that is why the symbol survived every translation. Because chaos and order are never just ancient concerns. They are still ours. Every life feels at times like a struggle to keep shape against the formless. Every memory risks sinking. Every culture fears forgetting itself. The phoenix answers those fears not by promising safety from fire, but by placing fire inside a larger rhythm. The final transformation of the phoenix, then, is not from bird to symbol, or from Egypt to Greece, or from pagan myth to Christian emblem. The final transformation is from ancient story to permanent habit of mind. The bird teaches people how to imagine survival, not crude survival, not mere continuation, but transformed return. And that lesson proves endlessly reusable. So let the room grow quieter now. Let the candle burn lower. Let all the ancient places we have crossed tonight, the waters of Nun, the sacred trees of Heliopolis, the fragrant pyres of Arabia, the battlefields, libraries, temple courts, and philosophers' rooms, begin to settle into one long afterimage. The phoenix has flown through all of them. It has changed with each one. It has shed meanings and gathered new ones. It has been misheard, embellished, borrowed, baptized, dramatized, and admired. And through all that, it never lost its central gift. It kept offering humanity the same gentle, impossible thought, that what is most essential may survive the fire. Before we leave it there, I want to linger on one last small irony. The phoenix became famous as a creature that defeats death, yet what it really defeats again and again is forgetting. Fire is only one part of its work. The other part is memory carried forward under altered form. Egypt remembered the dawn. Greece remembered the marvel. Rome remembered the omen. Philosophers remembered the paradox. Christians remembered the resurrection shape. Later ages remembered the emblem even when they forgot the temple. That is why the bird never truly disappears. Someone is always remembering some part of it, and the forgotten parts wait patiently in the dark until another age rediscovers them and says, "Ah, there you are." You know that feeling when an old melody returns to you after years, and you realize it had been living somewhere in the back of the mind all along. The phoenix works like that in culture. It goes quiet, then returns. It burns down into a phrase, an image, a scrap of design on a page, and then rises again when a new generation needs it. For a symbol born from deep time, that seems exactly right. It is never wholly absent, only waiting for the next mind, the next crisis, the next poem, the next night, beside a small flame where someone asks whether endings are really endings after all. Good night.